My name is Lisa. I'm 38 years old. I live in California, in a small town where everyone knows each other, but no one looks into someone else's soul. I have a husband, Tom, and two children, a 14-year-old Emily and a 10-year-old Jack. At first glance, we have the perfect family. A house with a well-kept garden, Sunday picnics, and family photos to be proud of. Tom is reliable, caring, and loving. We've been married for 15 years, and he has always been my support. But I am not the perfect wife. When I look in the mirror, I see a woman consumed by her own shadow. My smile is a mask, my tenderness a lie. I have been cheating on Tom since the very beginning of our marriage. It wasn't planned or deliberate. Rather, it's like an addiction I can't shake off. Every time I do it, a fire of passion ignites within me, but it leaves only the ashes of shame. My first infidelity happened on our wedding day. I don't even know how it happened. Maybe it was the fear of a new life, or my desire to escape from what seemed too perfect. Since then, my life has become a chain of similar moments. Each time, I promised myself I would stop, but I couldn't. It's not just physical attraction. It's a sense of freedom, risk, the opportunity to become someone else, even if only for a moment. I don't know how to explain it. My head tells me that I am destroying my family, but my heart, burning with a thirst for something forbidden, betrays me again and again. Sometimes it feels like I live in two worlds. One where I am a good mother and wife, and another where I am a woman who knows no boundaries. My family is my anchor, but every time I look at my children, I feel guilty. Emily is not Tom's daughter. He doesn't know this, and I'm afraid to imagine what will happen if he ever finds out. It was my most terrible act, for which I pay every minute of my existence. I'm telling you this not to justify myself. I want to understand what's wrong with me. Why can't I just be happy with Tom? Why am I always looking for something more? This double life is destroying me from within, but I can't stop. My first infidelity occurred on a day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life. My wedding day. I stood in a white dress, smiled at the guests, held Tom's hand, and tried to believe I was making the right choice. He looked at me with such love that warmth spread through me, and at the same time fear. Not fear of marriage or commitment, but something deeper, as if I was closing the door to freedom behind me. At the reception, I already felt like I was at someone else's party. Tom was busy with the guests, talking to parents, laughing with friends. And I was drinking champagne, feeling not only the alcohol, but also the excitement that was washing over me. That's when I first met Joshua, a friend of one of the guests. Tall, with a casual grace in his movements and a bold smile, he immediately caught my attention. When he approached me with a glass of wine, and casually mentioned how beautiful a bride I was, I felt something inside me stir. We started talking, just a few phrases, but there was something captivating, dangerous in his voice. I laughed at his jokes and realized that a desire was growing inside me that I couldn't control. Tom, meanwhile, was dancing with my sister, and I felt completely invisible. That was the moment when everything lost meaning. I went out into the hallway to catch my breath, but Joshua followed me and closed the door from the inside. We found ourselves in a cramped bathroom, and I don't know who made the first move. I remember his hot hands, his breath in my ear. I remember holding the hem of my dress in my hands, while he moved behind me in rhythm with my heavy breathing. Everything happened quickly, spontaneously, and at that moment, I felt disconnected from reality. It wasn't passion or love. It was my first step toward self-destruction. When I returned to the hall, Tom looked at me with such warmth that my knees buckled. I smiled, hugged him, and pretended nothing had happened. It was the most horrible feeling. Guilt and shame mixed with bitterness from the fact that it wasn't enough for me. The wedding became the beginning of my double life. I tried to convince myself that it was a one-time thing, that I could control myself. But Joshua was just the first in a long line of men who became my way to escape reality. When I went to bed on our first wedding night next to Tom, I felt burned with guilt inside. I promised myself that it would never happen again. But even then, I knew I was lying to myself. After the wedding, I desperately tried to be the perfect wife. I cooked dinners, smiled at Tom, told him how much I loved him, For a while it really seemed like I could fix myself. But the memories of Joshua and that night wouldn't let me go. They haunted me in my dreams and in moments of silence. I felt like I was on the edge of an abyss, getting closer to the fall with each step. 2 years after the wedding, at my brother-in-law's anniversary celebration, I slipped up again. That day, I was sure everything was under control. We arrived at the party together, holding hands like a happy couple. But soon Tom got caught up in conversation with friends, and I was left alone in the crowd. That's when I noticed him, Mark, the younger brother of Tom's friend. He was a few years younger than me, with an easy smile and undisguised interest in his eyes. At first we just talked. He asked about my marriage, paid me compliments, called me the most beautiful woman at the party. I laughed, trying not to take his words seriously, but inside, everything was burning. His attention acted on me like a drug, and I lost control. It happened in one of the empty rooms of the house, while the guests were busy dancing. I knew it was wrong, knew I was risking everything, but I couldn't stop. We moved not like lovers, but more like animals who want only to satisfy their desire for each other. After that I felt awful. Returning to the guests, I avoided Tom's gaze. It seemed like everything was written on my face, that anyone who looked at me would immediately understand what I had just done. Tom came up to me with a glass of champagne, hugged me, and said he loved me. I could barely hold back tears. On the way home, I looked at his profile in the light of the street lamps and hated myself. Why do I do this to him? To us? I understood that I had repeated the same mistake, but even the feeling of guilt couldn't stop me. That night, I tried to be especially tender with Tom, as if that way I could erase my betrayal. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it was another isolated incident, that it wouldn't happen again. I sincerely wanted to believe that I could stop. But the truth is that inside me lived this irresistible desire, a craving for something forbidden, dangerous. And every time I looked at Tom, my guilt became even more unbearable. 5 years after the wedding, Tom and I began to experience a small crisis. Nothing serious, just everyday disagreements, fatigue brought on by children, work, and the monotony of everyday life. Tom remained an attentive husband, but it seemed to me that our connection had weakened. Our intimate life was fading, and those same thoughts that I tried to suppress began to arise in my head again. One day, I went to a conference in San Francisco. It was a work event, and Tom insisted that I take a break. He stayed home with the kids, and for the first time in a long time, I found myself alone in a hotel. In the evening, after the presentations, the conference participants went to a bar. There I met Kevin, a successful, confident man in his 40s. He was one of those people who always know what to say to make you feel special. We sat at the bar, talked about work, and shared stories from life. But soon the conversation became more personal. I felt his gaze studying me, his words becoming bolder. At first, I tried to keep my distance, but the more glasses I drank, the more I was overwhelmed by that same feeling of freedom and risk. That night, when everyone had left, we ended up in my room. I knew what I was doing, but at the same time, I felt like I couldn't stop. It was something like a drug, adrenaline, a sense of power, the desire to forget. After it happened, I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to his even breathing. Tom was probably putting our kids to bed at that moment, maybe thinking about me. This thought tore me apart, but not enough to keep me from doing something similar in the future. Returning home, I tried again to become the perfect wife. Tom met me with a smile, asked about the trip, and I played the role, skillfully hiding my betrayal. But inside I felt awful. Every time he hugged me or kissed me, I remembered that night in the hotel. Shame became my constant companion, but it couldn't extinguish the fire that burned inside me. I understood that this was more than just occasional weaknesses. It had become a part of me that I couldn't control. I tried to find excuses: fatigue, dissatisfaction, the desire to escape the routine. But perhaps all this was just a smokescreen behind which hid my inability to be honest, not only with Tom, but also with myself. When Jack turned 3 and Emily was about 7, our family seemed even more united. Tom seemed to think that we had overcome all the early difficulties of marriage, and now everything would be easier. He was right. Outwardly, everything looked ideal. But inside me, everything continued to crumble. Every morning, looking at my husband, I wondered how he couldn't notice that I was lying. Maybe he just didn't want to see the truth. Another betrayal happened during an ordinary trip to the gym. I always justified myself to Tom by saying that exercising helped me stay in shape and relieve stress. In reality, it was my way to escape the house, where the perfect picture of our life began to suffocate me. That's where I met Ryan, a young trainer with a disarming smile. He was everything Tom never was: spontaneous, bold, free from obligations. At first, everything was innocent. We exchanged polite smiles. He helped me with exercises, paid me compliments. But then his hands began to linger on me a little longer than they should, and his glances became more and more frank. I knew where this was leading, but I didn't try to stop it. It was another escape, a chance to feel like someone else. One day after training, when the gym was already empty, he offered to stay and show me some new exercises. That night, everything happened right there in the empty room. I didn't even think about the fact that we could be caught. At that moment, it didn't matter. I gave in to my desire again, and again. Shame washed over me like a cold shower as soon as I got home. Tom was putting the kids to bed at that moment. I watched him from the doorway. How he straightened the blanket on Jack, kissed Emily on the forehead. He was so kind, so caring. I hated myself for what I was doing to him, for continuing to play the role of the perfect wife, hiding behind a mask. That night, I lay next to Tom, unable to sleep. I looked at the ceiling, trying to find at least some justification for my actions. But there was none. I knew my marriage was crumbling, but I couldn't understand how to stop this fall. My desire to continue these secret affairs seemed stronger than me, as if I were not just a traitor, but also a hostage of my own weaknesses. When Emily turned 9, our family still seemed perfect on the outside. Tom worked hard, I took care of the house and children. But inside me, everything was getting worse. The secret affairs that I promised myself to stop continued to multiply, turning my life into an endless web of lies. One of the most painful of my mistakes was the incident with Peter, a neighbor who lived across the street. Peter was a widower in his 40s who had recently moved to our neighborhood. His gaze was always attentive, lingering on me a little longer than was appropriate. At first I ignored it, but deep down, I felt that it attracted me. One evening, when Tom was late at work and the kids were playing in the yard, Peter came over under the pretext of asking for something for the household. I remember how we talked in the kitchen, how the tension between us became almost palpable. He came closer, his hand accidentally touched mine, and everything inside me flared up. It was probably the most humiliating of all my actions. Everything happened in the house where I lived with my family, where my children grew up, where Tom believed I was his faithful companion. After Peter left, I sat in the kitchen, unable to lift my eyes, as if the room itself was judging me. The next day, I tried to act as usual, smile, play the role of a good wife and mother. Tom didn't notice anything as always, but I couldn't look him in the eye. It seemed like the walls of our house had absorbed my lie, and were ready to give me away at any moment. After this incident, for the first time, I seriously thought that I couldn't live like this anymore. My guilt became unbearable, but despite this I couldn't stop. My infidelities no longer brought me joy or liberation. They had become like a painful habit that I couldn't get rid of. Every morning, looking in the mirror, I saw a woman I hated. I knew I was betraying Tom, and would ruin my children's lives if the truth came out. But I couldn't change anything. My desire for freedom, which I sought in these men, had turned into an even greater dependence for me. 2 years ago, the most dangerous incident happened when I started a relationship with Tom's colleague Eric. We crossed paths at several work meetings, and I immediately felt attracted to him. He was charismatic, confident, with a hint of boldness that always attracted me. One day, Tom invited him to our house for dinner. That was the first mistake. Eric behaved quite friendly, but his glances revealed more than words. When Tom left the room to put the kids to bed, He came closer than he should have. His hand touched mine for a moment. It was a short, almost imperceptible touch, but I knew what it meant. And I knew I couldn't resist. We started meeting secretly, using work meetings and business trips as an excuse. One day, during dinner with Tom, I caught myself thinking that I was sitting across from two men, one of whom I was betraying, and the other I was using to continue this lie. Tom was talking about vacation plans, sharing his ideas, and I was sitting there barely hearing him, consumed by my guilt. The worst thing was that Eric began to suspect that I would never leave Tom. He started demanding more, threatening to tell everything. At some point, I realized that I was in a trap that I had created myself. My fear of exposure reached its peak. I broke everything off with Eric, but the consequences of this affair haunted me for a long time. Every time Tom mentioned his name or talked about work, I felt panic spreading inside me. It seemed like everyone already knew, that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And yet, despite this fear, I continued to cheat. My inner destruction had become too strong to simply stop. I understood that I had long passed the point of no return. Each new betrayal became even more painful, but I couldn't break free from this spiral. My guilt no longer went away. It had become a part of me, like breathing or a heartbeat. Now I'm 38. 15 years of marriage, 2 children, a house that seems like the embodiment of the American dream. But inside this perfect facade, I feel empty, broken. I live in constant lies, in fear that everything I've built will collapse in an instant. Sometimes it seems like Tom knows, but prefers to keep quiet, so as not to destroy our family well-being. Or maybe he just doesn't see the truth, because he trusts me too much. I can't hide from myself anymore. My infidelities have become an addiction that I can't control. It's not just fleeting weaknesses. It's a way to fill the void that I can't cope with. Every time I'm with someone else, I feel alive, but this feeling doesn't last long. It is replaced by a wave of shame and guilt that wash over me. Emily is growing up, and I'm increasingly wondering what will happen if she finds out who her mother really was. After all, she doesn't know that Tom is not her biological father. And I'm afraid that the truth will come out one day, perhaps when it's too late to fix anything. My secret is not just my burden, but also a threat to her life, to her perception of family and trust. I ask myself questions to which I can't find answers. Why do I do this? Why can't I stop? Do I love Tom, or is it just a habit, an illusion of stability? If I really love him, how can I continue to do this to him? But if I don't love him, then why am I still here? Sometimes I think about telling everything, spilling the truth, like pus from a wound, to at least try to start over. But what then? Tom will leave, take the kids. Emily will find out the truth, and her world will collapse. Can I live with that? Or is it better to keep quiet, leaving everything as it is, until my inner pain destroys me completely? I need to find a way out, to break this addiction, to learn to live without lies. But how? I feel like a person drowning in a stormy river. I see the shore, but I don't know how to get to it. Every step I take seems wrong, every choice another mistake. I want to be better. For Tom, for the kids, for myself. But for that I have to face the truth. Admit that I am not the perfect wife, not the perfect mother, not even the perfect person. The question is whether I have the strength to take that step. Or will I remain in my lie, slowly destroying everything that is important to me?